The sun was shining brightly over the city. Multi-story buildings and small houses were located near the vast sea, surrounding it all around. People were walking along the streets of the city. Somewhere a mother and a child were walking. Somewhere two friends were having fun and laughing. Somewhere a businessman in a dark suit and carrying a briefcase was walking. Among them was a guy who was just as inconspicuous as all the other passers-by. He had dark hair and a dark sweatshirt, and a beige vest was draped over it. The phone in his pocket vibrated, and he took it out, watching the screen light up. He opened the notifications tab and saw a message from a girl named Choi Jae-min asking the guy, calling him Do Hyuk, where he was right now. The guy smiled as he looked at the phone screen. He had dark hair and bright yellow eyes. Do Hyuk started typing a message, distracted from the road, and didn't notice the huge man who was walking towards him. Do Hyuk bumped into him, causing him to be thrown back a little. The huge man was dressed in a dark blue jacket and green pants, and there was a huge bald spot on his head in the most prominent place. He was carrying a bag of groceries and other contents in front of him, blocking his view of the road with the bag. The stranger looked down at Do Hyuk with a dark expression. Do Hyuk immediately smiled awkwardly and started bowing to him and apologizing for the sudden confrontation. The man who had been glaring at him a few seconds ago immediately changed his face and smiled. His plump cheeks turned red and he, covered in sweat, also began to apologize in response, saying that it wasn't a big deal. He walked past Do Hyuk as he continued to stand where he was, awkwardly rubbing his head. After a while, Do Hyuk found himself in front of a store that had a huge green sign over it that read Food Market. Do Hyuk typed Choi Jae's reply that he was already in the store, and the girl immediately responded with an okay. Do Hyuk clenched his hands into fists, trembling a little, and then happily raised his hand up and shouted to himself that everything was going great, which immediately attracted the attention of strangers around him, who turned to look at him questioningly. Do Hyuk smiled, still holding the phone in plain sight. Do Hyuk was a freshman student. He has no friends at all, but it seems that a girl has appeared who cares about him. Her name was Choi Jae-min. The girl had short brown hair, pinned-up bangs, round glasses, and bright purple eyes. Until recently, it was only possible to observe it from afar. One day, Do Hyuk was training while breathing heavily. Wearing boxing gloves, he practiced a series of punches with a trainer. Jae-min, who was watching nearby, shouted loudly about how he could do it, which caused Do Hyuk to immediately get distracted by her, blushing a little at the girl's attention, and didn't notice the coach's punch flying straight at his face. They met at a club where they joined to get in shape. While we were still trying to achieve our goal, we became friends and started chatting about all sorts of different things. About your favorite books, movies, games, and music. They exchanged minor messages and stories, and finally, this weekend, they agreed to have dinner at the guy's house. We'll have to make something up in a hurry. Do Hyuk rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he thought about what exactly to cook for him. Meat and vegetables. He thought about getting something else to drink. Do Hyuk immediately started thinking about what might follow after dinner. Jae-min, her face flushed, shyly asked about whether she could sleep in the same bed with Appa today. Do Hyuk shrugged and thought about why not. There was definitely a chance, wasn't there? Do Hyuk's face immediately turned red and he walked without noticing how he was giggling happily with a satisfied smile on his face. A woman standing nearby with a baby in her arms told the girl not to point her finger at the strange uncle. Do Hyuk's thoughts were suddenly interrupted. He stopped where he was, looking up at the huge tower that rose up among all the other buildings. It was a black tower that was shaped like a screw. One day, this thing that was just over 200 meters tall just appeared out of nowhere. In total, there are 2365 such towers in the world, and when they appeared, people immediately fell into an indescribable panic. They are studied by religious and scientific organizations of all countries, but so far no one has learned anything about them. The tower just stands still, but you get used to this thing pretty quickly. Do Hyuk was walking through the store with a basket full of groceries. Not far from the cash register, a smiling cashier was taking an order, and somewhere a woman with a child in her arms was choosing a product. Interest in the tower lasted no more than 3 weeks. Soon everyone was back to normal, including him. Do Hyuk smiled grimly to himself as he took out his wallet from his pocket, counting out the money. He thought to himself that from today onwards, he would definitely have to save money. Do Hyuk held out the card, paying for the purchases. A voice in the darkness repeated the word fight several times. The strange creature grinned from ear to ear, and the gears of the machine spun. Do Hyuk felt as if a blow had passed through his body. He frowned, eyes wide, and sweat began to run down his forehead. He couldn't understand what had just happened, and was he imagining it? Do Hyuk smiled nervously as he continued to hand the card to the cashier. He asked her to take the card when he was startled and saw what was happening to the cashier. Her face turned blue, her eyes rolled back in her head, and her mouth fell open. Saliva began to flow from his mouth and his tongue fell out, falling on its side. The girl's eyes began to fill with blood, and the capillaries in her eyes tightened. She jumped off abruptly and started swaying from side to side, and the cashier screamed loudly as the veins stood out on her face. Do Hyuk immediately jumped back in horror, not understanding what was happening. He watched the situation with his eyes and mouth wide open. Do Hyuk was paralyzed, and he smiled nervously as he continued to stare at the woman with a startled look. A voice shouted loudly and told someone to come help. Suddenly, another person nearby dropped the basket of groceries from his hands and they rolled on the floor. He immediately began to show the same symptoms as the woman. The stranger froze in one position and threw his head back, his whole body trembling. The man began to shake his head from side to side in the same way, while continuing to shout loudly. One by one, the store's customers began to show exactly the same symptoms. Do Hyuk looked around in horror, not understanding what was happening. Everyone around him started to turn into zombie-like creatures. Suddenly, the cashier who was the first to be possessed spoke up loudly. Do Hyuk immediately looked over and saw the woman looking at her hands and shaking slightly. There were tears in the corners of her eyes and she was talking loudly about how she was still alive. All of a sudden, all those possessed people who had been behaving like zombies a few seconds ago started behaving the same way. Do Hyuk stared at the people in front of him with his mouth open and wondered what was going on here. People started shouting out strange phrases that they would start all over again with a clean slate, and that this time they would definitely become the strongest. Suddenly, a body bumped into Do Hyuk's back. He was still standing in one place, frozen when he decided to look behind him. The corpse of a man was leaning on it, a sharp object protruding from his head and blood oozing out. Do Hyuk looked back and saw a shop assistant covered in blood at the side. She was grinning from ear to ear and holding a stationary knife and scissors in both hands. The girl continued to smile as long as there were traces of blood on her face and uniform, and after thanking them for the purchase, she told them to come back to them. Suddenly, a girl with 2 ponytails and a backpack on her back flashed past the cashier. Its hand was like a claw, and it flew over the worker and cut her head in two. A stream of blood immediately sprayed onto Do Hyuk. The girl with the crazy fang smile said thoughtfully, "Could it be that she could already use essence?" Another shop worker appeared next to her and opened her mouth wide, grabbed the girl and bit off half of her body. People madly started shouting and talking about how this scoundrel took advantage of the essence. Another voice stammered and repeated words about where his status window and his ability were. One of the strangers with long blonde hair said the word status, and a system notification flashed up, stating that the conditions for activating the CO2 essence were met. The blonde breathed on his hand, and the hand immediately began to ice until it was completely covered in a hard crust, turning the hand into a huge ice fist. He lifted it up and started walking towards the other man, while the other man was leaning back against the wall and with his hand raised in front of him, telling him to stop because he couldn't use the essence yet, and was it really time to start? The man shivered and stared in horror as the stranger with the icy hand grinned. He didn't listen to the man's pleas that he didn't want to die, and with a sharp flick of his hand, he slashed at the man as thick blood sprayed out from the spot of impact, smashing the man's head. Do Hyuk stared in horror at what was happening, drops of blood splattering on his face. The Iceman's fist was covered in thick blood. Suddenly, another man caught Do Hyuk's attention, and his gaze snapped up. The man was wearing a long jacket and was hiding his hands in his pockets with a smirk on his face. His smile became just as crazy and he shouted out loud that Do Hyuk was here. Suddenly, the other people turned at the sound of the name and started repeating it over and over again. Someone said Great King Do Hyuk and that it can't be true and it's all nonsense. And if he's here, if the level 1 Great King is here, then if that's the case, then we can start all over again. A frenzied crowd covered in blood began to slowly head towards Do Hyuk. They were all talking about killing Do Hyuk. Do Hyuk looked in front of him in horror. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The guy opened his mouth in disbelief at what was happening right now. One of the men took a bottle with its contents and broke it. The man with the broken bottle in his hand said that he would kill Do Hyuk himself with his own hands. The crowd kept coming at him. People kept coming. They said that they would kill Do Hyuk and take away his essence and many other strange things. Do Hyuk backed away and asked why him and why him. People were madly looking at him, and a man with a huge kitchen knife in his hands rushed straight at the man. Do Hyuk barely dodged, causing him to fall to the ground and hit his back against the guardrail behind him. The knife was right next to his face. The man who attacked him kept saying that the guy should die. He was breathing heavily and looked at Do Hyuk with burning eyes. Do Hyuk looked back at him with an undisguised look of horror on his face. He couldn't believe that this was all real, and that this must surely be some kind of joke on him. Suddenly, Do Hyuk was hit in the face, causing him to be thrown a couple of meters away. The man smiled madly and said that the guy was his prey. Do Hyuk stared at him and couldn't believe his eyes. All of them seriously wanted to kill him. The huge crowd was still closing in on him when Do Hyuk suddenly took off and started running away from them. How did they even know his name? And why him? Why did they try to kill him and why is everything getting more abnormal? People kept running after him, killing the first people they could find. Yoo Hayek pulled out his phone and the number 112 lit up on the screen, but no one answered. Yoo Hayek stared madly at his phone, and all he could think about was that he needed to get out of here right away. He ran out of the store and didn't notice the car rushing in his direction. The car crashed into Yoo Hayek and he fell to the ground, rolling over several times. The car crashed into a lamppost, causing the car to crumple. Suddenly, the car door was kicked out and a man came out, who turned Yoo Hayek in and attacked him. A man with a smile on his face and hungry eyes got out of the car and told him not to run too far. Yoo Hayek immediately took off in terror and ran down the road, unexpectedly bumping into the man he had seen earlier in the morning and bumped into. Yoo Hayek grabbed the man's shoulders and started yelling at him to help him and that he was being chased by a mad killer. The chubby man turned to the boy and asked him if he was the Yoo Hayek, and the boy replied with a smile that he was. The man turned his full body toward him. He had an axe in one hand and a flame of fire in the other. There were corpses of people all around this person, and the body and clothes were covered in blood. He gave Yoo Hayek a crazy smile and said that he seemed to be lucky this time. The plump man held up a hand that had a fire burning in it and started to burn even brighter. With a mad face, the man shouted out and said that the place in the Phenomenal Nine would be his. Yoo Hayek covered himself, but the man didn't have time to hit him. Suddenly, out of nowhere, chains stabbed into his back, and he was hit by a strong bolt of electricity. The chubby man immediately shook and screamed. When the man fell, the figure of a girl with a gun was standing behind him. It was Jae-min. She was covered in blood and asked with a serious face if Yoo Hayek was okay. Yoo Hayek couldn't believe his eyes and stared at her questioningly. The man who was chasing Yoo Hayek clenched his jaw in displeasure. Suddenly, a huge crowd was rushing towards them, weapons drawn. Jae-min changed the projectile in her weapon and told the man that he was very lucky that she was here nearby, and that he needed to be careful because the man on the ground was still alive. Yoo Hayek looked at Jae-min questioningly as they were slowly surrounded. Jae-min kept her weapon ready and told the guy to be careful and that it was better for him to run away now. Yoo Hayek yelled and asked the girl why they were enemies and what happened, since everything was normal a moment ago. Jae-min asked, did he really think that what was happening was normal? People were killing each other, there was chaos everywhere. The streets were ablaze, blood streaked everywhere. Yoo Hayek shivered and stared blindly in front of him, stammering and unable to answer anything intelligible to the girl's words. Yoo Hayek backed up and accidentally stepped on a strange girl's corpse. She was lying in a huge pool of blood, her tongue hanging out of her mouth and her eyes bulging out of their sockets. Yoo Hayek accidentally crushed the corpse's arm with his foot, causing him to immediately jump back in horror, a mixture of disgust and horror on his face. Yoo Hayek immediately threw up as Jae-min, who was standing nearby, told him to come to his senses immediately, and if he continued like this, those madmen would kill them too in no time. She yelled at him to get moving, because something was about to start, and that it was best to leave the questions for later. Jae-min took off her bloodstained glasses. She walked up to Yoo Hayek and held out her hand with a serious face, saying that it was time for them to leave. Yoo Hayek looked over his shoulder at her. He looked exhausted, covered in blood, drooling from his mouth, and tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. He asked with a haggard expression exactly where they were going. Jae-min stepped on the discarded glasses on the ground and replied with a smile that of course she would go to his house. The gears continued to turn. A tall black tower rose high, and an orange glow radiated from the tower. Jae-min and Yoo Hayek ran into the building, closing the door. Yoo Hayek immediately leaned on it and tried to catch his breath. He stammered and asked the girl what it was all about. Jae-min closed the door, turning the lock on it. She looked at him and said that's what she thought, that he really doesn't remember anything. Nothing that happened before the return. Yoo Hayek clarified exactly what kind of comeback she was talking about. Jae-min ignored him and walked forward to the middle of the room, thoughtfully saying that they needed to find some weapons. The girl then explained that in short, people just want to kill him, and Yoo Hayek is the most attractive target for them. Yoo Hayek stood there with his eyes wide open. Jae-min went to the window and opened the curtains a crack as Yoo Hayek yelled about how he hadn't done anything and there was no reason for them to kill him. Jae-min gave him a serious look and told him to calm down, which only made Yoo Hayek yell harder, squeezing his eyes shut and saying that how could he even be calm in this situation when he had seen the killers with his own eyes. The girl came up and grabbed him sharply by the scruff of the neck, frowning gravely and telling him to come to his senses immediately, because in a few hours it would be midnight and someone would come to take over the land. Yoo Hayek stared at her, not understanding what exactly she was talking about. He opened his eyes in surprise and fell silent. Jae-min explained that he must win this battle and must lead the people to kill the cursed god. Yoo Hayek smiled nervously and asked, stammering, what kind of murder and what kind of god was she even talking about? Yoo Hayek laughed nervously. He asked how this was even possible. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Jae-min looked back and said that it was an earthquake, and did it really start? It was too early. Jae-min ran to the windowsill and pulled open the curtains. A huge funnel formed outside the window, and a strong pulse was emitted from it. It was the same black tower that began to randomly rotate around itself, blowing everything in its range away with a shockwave. Yoo Hyuk opened his eyes wide, and suddenly, something appeared in front of his eyes. A notification flashed up that read, Universe 54 MRA Planet 913, launch of the Casita Needle program. Suddenly, Yoo Hyuk was hit with an electric shock, causing him to bend in two and scream loudly. Jae-min immediately whirled around to face him. Yoo Hyuk continued to shout loudly. He felt as if his body was about to be torn into small pieces. He fell to the floor as the electricity continued to shoot through his entire body. Another system notification was displayed, which read, Body Enhancement, Force Development. Yoo Hyuk looked back and saw that the girl had also been hit by a strong bolt and had fallen to the floor while her body was writhing in agony. After a while, Yoo Hyuk let go and slowly opened his eyes. He sat up and rubbed his forehead, wondering if this was even happening to them. He saw the girl who was still lying on the floor unconscious and immediately ran up to her and began to shake her restlessly by the shoulders. Jae-min opened her mouth slightly and exhaled. It was lucky that nothing terrible happened and that the pain disappeared without a trace. Yoo Hyuk also noticed another change in his body, namely that he had grown up a bit. He looked down at his hands in front of him and clenched his hand into a fist as the muscles in his arm showed. A strange power surged in his hands. A system notification flashed in front of his eyes, which read, Individual Yoo Hyuk, Body Enhancement completed, say status to check the ability indicators. Yoo Hyuk rubbed his eyes and thought that it was probably just a hallucination. There was no time to think about what and how, but reality is reality, and all that remained was to try to adapt to it. Yoo Hyuk shouted the word status loudly and a system table appeared in front of him with information. Status, abilities, physical strength, 17, strength, 21, speed, 15, magic, 2, stamina, 17, attractiveness, 14, religion, absent, technique, absent, feature of existence level 2, you have the wolf's eye. Yoo Hyuk stared at the information in front of him with a shocked face and was completely at a loss for words. Jae-min was already standing next to him with a smile on her face and crossed her arms, saying that it was a window, and it seemed like everything was right and that he would get tired of staring at it in the future. So far, its stats were at a basic level. Yoo Hyuk looked back at the girl and noticed that she had also changed in appearance like him and looked more attractive. Jae-min smiled and said with a smile on her face that the same thing had happened to him. The bodies were forcibly refined to the limit. Yoo Hyuk lifted up his t-shirt and saw that he had abs and cubes where his stomach should have been. He asked the girl how this was possible, and did God do it? Jae-min went to the windowsill and told the guy to look outside. The city was completely destroyed. There were shards of buildings and destroyed houses everywhere. The city was more like a ruin. There were two moons in the sky. One of them was ordinary and larger than the other, while the other was smaller and bright red in color. The Black Tower still stood in the middle of the ruined city. They were in a multi-world created by the Black Tower. Each time the tower rotated, a different world was superimposed on the tower. Now, the people of this world were going through a comeback as they started to transform into strange creatures. Coming back meant that the memories from the future were coming back, and as Yoo Hyuk could see, her memory was also coming back from the future. Yoo Hyuk asked what it meant, from the future. Jae-min looked at him seriously and replied that it was different from the future he imagined. The god who contributed to the appearance of the Black Tower forcibly refined people and gave everyone their own abilities. Abilities were called essence. People could take essence from each other, so they were forced to play a deadly game called enlightenment. No matter who started this game, from that moment on, a real battle to the death broke out. During the entire existence of the enlightenment, many died. As a result, there were 9 people among people whose powers surpassed God. People who were equal to God were feared and called the Phenomenal 9. Jae-min turned to the guy while Yoo Hyuk looked at her with a shocked face. She told him to try to remember as soon as possible that he was called the Great King and was actually the strongest of the 9. Yoo Hyuk smiled nervously, sweating profusely, and said that this was the first time he had heard about it. Yoo Hyuk clenched his hand into a fist and shook. He asked that since this was the case, then everyone around him wants to kill him just because of this essence. Jae-min bent down to her feet and doubled over, then abruptly did a somersault and rolled over. She bent down again and said with a smile on her face that her essence was a flexible, rubber-like body, and that its capabilities were beyond ordinary human ones. Jae-min started to warm up and explained that there were only 2 essences that could be obtained, and that one was given initially, while the other was already obtained from the first opponent killed. Yoo Hyuk frowned and looked at the girl with a dark expression. Jae-min explained that this is why she doesn't even know what she would have to do if they ended up killing Yoo Hyuk. He remembered all the people around him shouting madly and saying that he should die. Yoo Hyuk looked away thoughtfully and quietly asked what kind of ability he had. Jaemin smiled and said that he didn't need to ask and that he could just concentrate and see for himself. Yoo Hyuk frowned, and a system sign appeared in front of his eyes that read, "Taste of Steel Essence." Jaemin asked if that was all, and Yoo Hyuk tensed up and saw the inscription below, which read, "First Essence Taste of Steel, Second Essence Beyond the Horizon obtained by killing Kasita." They both turned to the windowsill and looked at what was happening outside. People were mindlessly attacking and killing each other, blood splattering everywhere. Suddenly, the people stopped and looked up at the sky. A bright light appeared in the sky above the tower, and golden feathers began to fall from the sky. A strange creature covered in light feathers shone brightly in the sky. Below it was a broad halo. Suddenly, the cocoon of feathers opened and revealed a man lying in the center of it. Jaemin ran to the windowsill and leaned on it while Yoo Hyuk squinted in the bright light and asked who it was. The stranger hung in the sky, 2 pairs of wings behind him, a huge halo above his head. He was floating high above the ground. He was wearing jewelry on his head, and his eyes were a bright yellow color with blue stripes running down from them. He smiled and raised his huge staff in the air. Suddenly, a bright light swirled around the tower. Yoo Hyuk looked at his hands and the golden feathers around them. He caught one of the feathers that fell from the sky, and Jaemin immediately rushed towards him. She didn't have time to do anything when Yoo Hyuk disappeared into the same spot where he was standing a second ago. Jaemin bit her lip in displeasure and dashed away towards the door. Inwardly, she thought that her enlightenment had started earlier than she expected, but it should be fine with Yoo Hyuk because he is him. The girl continued to run down the long corridor as the tower was engulfed in bright light. One of the strangers looked back at the painting above the sky as he held the beaten man in his arms. One of the feathers landed right on his shoulder and he immediately disappeared just like that. People began to disappear one by one, touching the feathers that flew from the sky. Yoo Hyuk found himself in a gray place. He sat up, trying to regain his composure. He stood up and rubbed the bruised spot, wondering where he was and what had happened. How had he been transported to the foot of the Black Tower in just a second? He stood up and looked in front of him, seeing a huge tower that stretched upwards. Yoo Hyuk was standing right at the base of it. The rest of the people who got here also started to recover, getting up from the ground. Everyone stood up and looked at the tower in front of them. They saw that man with wings, even though Yoo Hyuk initially thought he was a bird. The man next to him also looked up and said, "Was it really him?" A man who looked like an angel appeared in front of them and spread his arms out to the sides with a smile on his face. Golden feathers were still flying from it. An angel with a crazy smile told them that they were in a specially isolated area, and everyone present here would have to pass a difficult test, and first they would need to deal with those creatures that entered them and surrounded them. At first glance, they were small creatures that looked like mice with green skin and a bandage around their thighs. The creature raised its paw and waved at the man who was standing next to Yoo Hyuk. The man said with displeasure that they were quite small, and what kind of specially isolated zone could we even talk about? They clearly underestimate them. The angel looked down at him grimly. He frowned in displeasure and then chuckled. The man immediately exploded in the same place. All that was left of him were his legs. The angel smiled madly and hung in the air, mockingly telling the other angel to look at these stupid fools and that he was already tired of babbling with them. The other angel next to him clutched his stomach and started laughing madly. Yoo Hyuk stared at them and didn't understand what was going on or what they were talking about. The other man next to the guy was covered in a golden liquid. He tried to remove the slime from himself and said that it smelled really bad, and where did this abomination come from? Suddenly, the man's head flew off to the side. Yoo Hyuk turned around and saw many corpses torn to pieces. Next to one of the bodies were green-skinned creatures that looked like goblins and were mindlessly stabbing blades in their hands. Another creature clung to the corpse's neck and began to gnaw madly at it. Suddenly, they broke off and looked at Yoo Hyuk. They immediately howled and formed a huge crowd in front of the people. The angel said with a crazy smile that the special pheromone he had just sprayed gave the goblins a little boost. He also added that those who score the most points for killing will receive a reward, and that the battle is about to begin. The goblins immediately raised their muzzles and howled loudly. The goblins rushed at the crowd of people and the battle began. They were grappling, some of them beating up goblins, and some of them were knocked down by them. One of the men with a huge stone fist started swinging them, his essence being a hammer fist. A system notification flashed, stating that 140 coins were received for killing a goblin. Another unknown girl also continued to kill one goblin after another. She said with a satisfied smile that her first essence accelerates the growth of plants, and the second allows you to control objects. Another system notification came up, stating that you had killed a goblin and your reward was 280 coins. The man with the stone fists was smiling madly and saying that it couldn't have been a test of the highest difficulty, and that their bites were the same as a normal tickle for him. He turned to Yoo Hyuk and asked him if he was numb with fear. Yoo Hyuk looked in his direction. The man who was suddenly distracted by him was impaled by one of the goblins behind him. It pierced through the man's throat and pierced right through, and he was immediately surrounded by many other goblins and pierced through his body with their weapons. Yudu Hayek watched in horror. One of the huge goblins grabbed her by the throat and lifted her up, and she screamed for him to let her go. People on all sides started shouting. The goblins continued to advance and tear them apart. One of the men shouted loudly about what had happened to them and why they hadn't died. He was immediately surrounded by goblins and surrounded on all sides. He kept shouting that they kept coming and coming back to life like zombies. Yudu Hayek continued to stand and look around in horror when one of the men covered in blood grabbed him by the leg of his pants and started talking about how it was strange that he couldn't move and that his lower back hurt. Yudu Hayek looked at the man on the ground in horror. The angels in the sky continued to watch and smile. Was that what they called a test? Yudu Hayek frowned and pursed his lips, his eyes burning with rage. For him, this was definitely utter nonsense. He saw one of the girls being dragged away by goblins, and he grabbed an iron beam, advancing on them with a loud cry. Yudu Hayek started waving around thoughtlessly and shouting at them not to dare approach and get out of here. Yudu Hayek looked back at the girl he thought he had saved and asked if she was okay and needed someone to cover her, but the girl was lying in a pool of blood, pierced by various objects and completely unconscious. Yudu Hayek noticed this and gritted his teeth. The angel smiled and said that he had warned them that the test would be difficult and unusual. Yudu Hayek stared at the goblins in front of him and wondered if they even had a chance to survive against them. The city was covered in rubble, with fire and shards of buildings littering everywhere. Yudu Hayek carried a fire extinguisher in his other hand and hit a passing goblin with it. He trudged through the streets of buildings. Yudu Hayek went down the stairs and sat down with his elbows on the railing. He looked around tiredly. No matter how many times he killed, there were always new ones in the end. How long can this last? The guy's dark thoughts were interrupted by the phone that fell out of his pocket. He looked at the phone that had fallen out and saw Jaemin's photo. Yudu Hayek decided that he definitely needed to find her. The guy said the word status and noticed that the indicators had changed. He saw a system sign in front of him with information on which the changed indicators were written. Abilities: physical strength 17 plus 2, strength 21 plus 2, speed 15 plus 2, magic 2, stamina 17, attractiveness 17, balance, number of points 740, achievements, first hunter plus 2 to your indicators of physical strength, speed. Yudu Hayek noticed the strength button and pressed it. The following system notification was displayed, in which it was written: strength, a parameter on which life force depends, resistance to physical attack, resistance to all kinds of external and internal damage, as well as the ability to naturally regenerate. Would you like to purchase +1 strength for 200 coins? Yes or no? Yudu Hayek frowned seriously and thought that it was definitely too early for him to die yet. He pressed the yes button, and a bright light immediately enveloped him. A system notification was displayed that said, "You have spent 600 coins, durability 24 plus 3. Suddenly, he was distracted by someone laughing behind the man. He saw a stranger with a crazy smile, holding a blade in his hands and looking at Yudu Hayek from the corner. A stranger with a smile on his face started stuttering to ask Yudu Hayek how he was feeling, and if he found a good item, and that those fools didn't drop anything worthwhile. Yudu Hayek immediately frowned and took up a stance, ready to defend himself if anything happened. The man with the mad face said that if he had a normal thing, he should give it back immediately, and with these shouts he rushed towards the young man, raising a knife above him. Yudu Hayek immediately grabbed him by the throat and threw him to the ground with a mad cry. He began to choke the man until he realized what he was doing. However, it was too late and the man underneath him was unconscious, his tongue falling out of his mouth and his eyes rolling back behind his lids. With a trembling hand, Yudu Hayek brought his fingers to his neck to check for a pulse, and immediately pulled his hand back with a horrified look on his face. He's dead. He killed a man. Just as Yudu Hayek relaxed, he saw a knife stuck in his arm. The man wasn't dead, and the guy immediately looked down at the weapon sticking out of his hand. The stranger laughed madly and asked him if he really thought he had died so easily. He jerked the knife sharply and sliced open his arm, causing Yudu Hayek to cry out loudly. The stranger said that the essence he received was pretending to be dead. He started swinging his knife and slashing at Yudu Hayek while Yudu Hayek screamed madly. The man smiled and added that this ability was so worthless that he even wanted to cry at the irony. He kicked Yudu Hayek in the back, and Yudu Hayek immediately fell to the ground, and then the stranger soared up into the air and jumped over him. The man laughed and licked the blood off the knife, saying the same thing with a stutter about how if Yudu Hayek wanted to kill him, he should be prepared to slit his throat. He also added for reference that the wounds inflicted by his knife do not heal, and if he leaves everything as it is, he will simply die of blood loss. Yudu Hayek stared at him as he clutched at the split wound on his arm. The stranger smiled crazily and took a deep breath as he stood over Yudu Hayek. He said that he would still cut it anyway until he dies. The stranger immediately stabbed him again, causing Yu Hayek to arch his back and scream loudly. With a crazed face, he kept stabbing him and telling him that he was pretty sure he'd gotten a lame item too. The man continued to stab him with the knife an endless number of times. Yu Hayek lay there, starting to slowly lose consciousness. His clothes were all covered in blood, and blood also spurted out of his mouth. Yu Hayek's eyes rolled back in her head. The boy's mind began to swim, and he began to think that he would die here. He recalled all the words he had already heard from others about dying or fighting. A voice rang out in his mind and told Yu Hayek to come to his senses. A system notification was displayed, which said that the conditions for activating the essence were met. The essence is the taste of steel. Yu Hayek's hand slowly moved as the stranger continued to stab at him with a crazed face. Yu Hayek put his hand out in front of him, and it pierced his palm. Another system notification was displayed, which read, Item Recognition, Knife Fang Item, E-Rank, Effect, Acceleration of Blood Loss, check for an E-Rank item. A subspecies of bone knife, composition, potassium phosphate, protein. You can give an order using a command to activate the food essence. Yu Hayek said the word food slowly, and a bright light immediately spilled out from the knife, causing the stranger to look up in horror. The stranger moved away from him while Yu Hayek held the knife tightly, sparkling with light. Yu Hayek clutched the knife in his hand as his eyes flashed with a bright light, and he immediately opened his lids. The wounds on his body were slowly starting to heal, and the stranger was looking at him with shock on his face. He couldn't believe what was happening and screamed out loud, but Yu Hayek quickly moved in front of him and punched him in the face, sending him flying to the side and falling to the ground. Yu Hayek bent down and told him that he didn't know how it happened, but he was already resigned to the fact that he was going to die. The stranger stood up and asked, did Yu Hayek eat his item and that's why he was healed? Yu Hayek bent down, leaning on the fire extinguisher on the ground. The stranger trembled and pointed a finger in his direction, asking him if Yu Hayek was the great king. Yu Hayek stood in front of him with a fire extinguisher on his shoulder and looked at him with a gloomy expression. That was Yu Hayek's essence. The stranger stared at him in horror and started to run in a panic, intending to hit Yu Hayek, but he immediately met Yu Hayek's face with the fire extinguisher. Yu Hayek immediately started beating him with a fire extinguisher, and after a while, the stranger lost consciousness. Yu Hayek walked up the stairs and looked back at the trail of blood that was trailing from him to the stranger on the ground. This time, he looked unconscious. A system notification was displayed that said, you have killed a person, the reward is 17 coins. Yu Hayek leaned against the wall and panted, his eyes widening. He was thinking that he had actually killed a man. And a reward for killing. What is it all about? Yu Hayek immediately turned ugly and threw up. He walked forward a bit and fell to the ground. His body was no longer working properly, and before he passed out, all he had time to think about was that if he passed out here now, it would be very bad later. His eyelids slowly closed. A system notification was displayed, which read, the conditions for activating an entity beyond the horizon are met. When the entity owner receives a stimulus that goes beyond the ordinary, his abilities increase in proportion to the impact of the stimulus, activation of supercompensation. Yu Hayek's eyes snapped open and he looked around. Outside the window, he saw that a bright light was already shining, which meant that it was already dawn. A system notification was displayed, which recorded his data, abilities, physical strength, 29 plus 2, strength, 30 plus 2, speed, 24 plus 2, magic, 2, stamina, 23, attractiveness, 21, balance, 757 coins, achievements, first hunter, plus 2 to physical strength, speed indicators. Yu Hayek thought, didn't you have to spend coins to improve your abilities? Or does the entity have another effect? Another notification of the system about the fulfillment of the condition for activating the entity was displayed. Yu Hayek broke off when he heard shouting nearby. One voice asked him to stop and that he would only come back, and the other voice told him that he couldn't. Yu Hayek picked up a fire extinguisher and hid behind the wall. One of the men was immediately pierced through by many chains and immediately fell to the ground unconscious. Yu Hayek watched the scene with his mouth wide open and shock on his face. He turned toward the stairs and was thinking about getting out when a voice heard him and asked who it was. On the window sat another angel with one wing on his back. He smiled and told Yu Hayek that they hadn't met before. The angel immediately changed his face and clenched his teeth, frowned in displeasure, and asked the guy if he really wanted to sneak out of here unnoticed, and if he really didn't have any motivation. Yu Hayek took a couple of steps back and frowned, holding the fire extinguisher at the ready. Yu Hayek thought to himself that this man was there when the monsters started killing people, and that he was the one who started it all. Yu Hayek clenched his teeth and frowned at him in front of him. He immediately rushed to the angel and tried to hit him with a fire extinguisher, but he easily parried the blow. The angel laughed wildly, opening his mouth wide and telling Yu Hayek that he was stupid to attack an angel, and that he was definitely an interesting guy. The angel extended a finger in his direction and hit Yu Hayek with a wave of light, causing him to drop his weapon. He looked at him with a crazy smile and told Yu Hayek that he clearly didn't look like the ones he usually tormented and killed. Yu Hayek looked back at him in disbelief and asked why the angels were doing this. The angel scratched his head and said that the enlightenment area hadn't moved in the past 3 days, and that was probably why. Yu Hayek opened his eyes in surprise and asked him again. He couldn't believe that it had been 3 days and that he had slept so much. The angel yawned and grabbed the boy by the scruff of the neck, lifting him into the air. He smiled and said that it was funny, and that since he was already a skitter, he should be confident in his abilities. Yu Hayek panicked and asked what exactly he was up to all of a sudden and for him to let him go. The angel carried him a short distance and threw him to the ground, causing Yu Hayek to immediately be thrown back several meters. The angel stretched his lips in a smile and said that it was even a pity that he was too relaxed. There were a lot of dead bodies everywhere, and in the very center sat a man in a raincoat and hood pulled up over his face, twisting chains over his head. Yu Hayek stared in horror at the entire scene in front of him. The angel smiled and told him that this was the main final boss and that he was very good. 2 white eyes and green skin shone out from under the hood, and he was breathing heavily. The surviving humans started to look around when they noticed the angels above them. One of the men told them to give the next test as soon as possible, and the girl next to him rubbed her neck and asked if it was going to involve goblins again. Another voice said that at least they could make more money than those other fools. One of the angels smiled madly and held out his hand in front of him, in which a bright blue ball lit up. He smiled and told them that it was amazing how much they were filled with determination. A system notification flashed that read, "Gate opening, summon named monster." The angel added that if so, then let them get a good bonus. In the middle of the road was a huge bright cross, which gave off a blue glow. Another angel smiled and said that he was absolutely sure that they would definitely appreciate this gift. Many iron chains immediately flew out from the giant cross, cutting people into various small pieces. Slowly, a hooded figure began to emerge from the cross. He went out and stood before the people. Almost all of his arms were wrapped in long chains, sharp needles protruded from his body, and his face was hidden under a dark hood. A system notification flashed that said named monster, Killer Chisek. A voice loudly told them to try to win and survive. Yu Hayek stared in horror at the creature that was sitting in the center of the pile of corpses and spinning the chains above its head. The angel smiled and said that he could challenge him too, and if he failed him, he would just get a whole bunch of coins. Angel also added that with a mediocre approach, it will definitely be difficult. One of the men standing nearby began circling the creature, moving quickly. In the hands of the man was a homemade weapon. The creature immediately sliced him in two without too much effort. Yu Hayek watched in horror as the angel put his hands behind his head and said with a smile and relaxed state that he had definitely underestimated Chichek's dynamic vision. The other 2 angels told them to quickly earn coins and increase their stats, and that with this level of ability, they couldn't even swat a fly. One of the men told them that they were bullies, and the other raised his hand and asked how they could earn coins if there were no more goblins. The angel smiled grimly and held out a hand, telling him not to be stupid, because you can kill more than just goblins. Hunting for people. The people in the crowd immediately tensed up and looked back at each other. They started to activate their abilities. Yu Hayek stood still and didn't immediately notice when a man appeared behind him. He smiled crazily, and just as Yu Hayek turned around, he saw a huge distorted shadow looming over him. The guy swallowed nervously and asked how much money he would get for killing that scoundrel. He was told that he would only know when he made the challenge, and that Yu Hayek was probably considering it. Yu Hayek bowed his head and replied with a grim face that if he wanted to escape anyway, they would kill him, and if he didn't do anything, he would die. Yu Hayek clenched his hand into a fist and thought that it was better to choose your own ending. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud voice of the man behind him. A man with hands like claws swung at Yu Hayek, but he immediately froze. The stranger felt and understood that his body was not moving. The angel next to him put out a hand and immediately froze him, telling him not to let the rednecks get in the way. The stranger immediately dispersed into small particles. The angel said matter-of-factly that it would be so if it was his way, and that he would still tell them about the reward that awaited him. This item that will drop from it will give Yu Hayek an undeniable advantage in future battles, and that he guarantees it. The angel smiled madly and told him to take a chance and try his chance, then laughed madly as his tongue swung from side to side. Yu Hayek thought that this lunatic was just sending him to his death. The angel pointed in the direction of another stranger and said to look at him, because he did not have an object in his hands and he was going to fight with his bare hands. Is he really tired of living? Or maybe he was just too sure of himself. Yu Hayek walked forward towards the creature while the angel flew down from above beside him. People started to turn in their direction. The angel asked what his plan was and added that the monster had a wide range of attacks and the sickles were so easy to avoid. The creature stood motionless, and only its bright red eyes could be seen, which glittered under the hood. A system notification flashed that said, named monster, Killer Chisek, physical strength, 30, strength, 21, speed, 30, magic, 11, stamina, 30, attractiveness, 6, skills, 7 hook cry technique, meat carving technique skill level 3, masochism level 2, sadism level 6, raw meat preference level 4, pain hook equipment. The hook hung from the creature's belt, covered in someone else's blood. Yudu Hayek started to analyze and thought about how they were equal in physical strength, but the monster's strength and speed were higher than his, and the advantage was on Yudu Hayek's side. He clenched his hand tightly into a fist. Yudu Hayek ran towards him without any weapons, and the monster's hooks immediately rushed towards him. Yudu Hayek dodged them, but one hook flew close enough to his arm and cut him, tearing his jacket where it hit. It almost hit him, and he knew there was no way to avoid the hook. The monster's hook immediately wrapped around his leg while he was distracted and hit Yudu Hayek against a lamppost. Yudu Hayek immediately arched his back in pain and let out a loud cry. The hook flew towards him again as Yudu Hayek clenched his hand into a fist and flexed his muscles, flying straight towards the monster. He didn't have time to hit it when the monster's hook grabbed him right by the shoulder. The hooks immediately bit into him from different directions, causing Yudu Hayek to bend down and shout loudly, grabbing at the places of the blows. The monster yanked on the hooks and pulled the guy towards it as he stared at it in horror. He tried to slow down, but found that there was no way he could stop. The monster threw Yudu Hayek over his head and slammed him into the side of the building. He threw the chains from side to side until Yudu Hayek fell to the ground covered in even more blood. The monster landed nearby and kicked Yudu Hayek's jaw. The people watching were talking to each other and asking if he even had a plan, or if Yudu Hayek went after the monster with only one fighting spirit. Yudu Hayek leaned over and breathed heavily. He was covered in blood. His eyes widened. He thought about how he was really going to die like this. The monster was already standing next to him when Yudu Hayek turned to face it. No, he didn't want to give up and decided to fight anyway. A system notification was displayed, which said, the conditions for activating the essence are met. The unique skill Taste of Steel used the word food to activate the ability. Yudu Hayek slowly said the word food, and a bright yellow light immediately surrounded him. In an instant, all of his lacerations had healed, and he was at the monster's side in a quick stride, slamming it across the jaw. The people watching said in surprise that Yudu Hayek ate the item and his wounds immediately healed. This essence tasted like steel. Yudu Hayek screamed loudly and started beating up the monster, continuing to hit it one after another. The monster screamed back and hit him on the neck with the hook. He started to beat it with a sickle, but it didn't have any effect on Yudu Hayek, and he continued to attack the monster with a mad, furious look and slapped it across the face. The monster staggered, and Yudu Hayek delivered the finishing blow, hitting several places with a quick movement. The monster fell on its back. Yudu Hayek sat on top of him and started punching him violently in the face. He gave him a final finishing blow to the head. It sent my head flying in all directions. People looked at it and said that this was the Great King. The strangers began to whisper among themselves and say that what he had done was the essence of the Great King. Yudu Hayek stood next to the fallen monster, his opponent's hook still sticking out from some places on his body. Yudu Hayek's gaze was wild and he couldn't feel the sickles sticking out in various places on his body. Yudu Hayek reached for the sickle that had pierced his face with a trembling hand and slowly said the word food. The wounds began to heal. Yudu Hayek spoke up and asked why he had met these scoundrels, how they knew him, and why they were trying to kill him. Yudu Hayek's reasons were unknown, however, he could only tell them not to come near him anymore. One of the angels was watching and giggling, the one who had encouraged him to fight the monster. Yudu Hayek added that if they ignored his warning, they might not expect any mercy from him. People started to recognize him and say that he was the same Yudu Hayek. Everyone began to prepare to attack him and began to activate their essences. Everyone was saying that if they killed him, they would definitely be able to become the strongest this time. One of the voices stopped them and said that Yudu Hayek had taken down this monster, and did they really think they were his match? And who would be able to deal with the great king Yudu Hayek? Yudu Hayek continued to stare at them in silence with a frown on his face. One of the angels clutched his stomach and started laughing randomly, saying that he was strong, and what a surprise, because he was planning to have fun, and he ended up killing the monster. The angel landed next to Yudu Hayek and leaned on his head, holding out something in his hand. There was a bright golden light in the man's hand, and he handed it to Yudu Hayek, the promised reward. A thick red book with an emblem and a drawing in the center of the book appeared in front of him. Yudu Hayek picked it up and took a closer look. Angel smiled and said that the guy was very entertaining and he hopes that Yudu Hayek will be a little more active in the future. Another angel smiled madly and turned to the ladies and gentlemen, telling them that the test must continue. He added that as they already know, the goblins were supposed to appear on the second day, but they were a little out of sync with the other areas while having fun in a specially isolated area. People looked up and saw a huge bright ball in the sky that was burning with light. 3 angels held him. The angel said that this was the reason why they were all going to go on a 2-day trial together. People saw the tower begin to rotate again, which meant that the worlds would overlap again. The ground began to split apart. Explosions and noises could be heard everywhere. The angel continued to smile and said that on the 3rd day of the challenge, they would be waiting for everyone in the new arena. Yudu Hayek started running away and tried to avoid the target area. The voice finally told them that the lords of the special zone should try to survive. Yudu Hayek found himself in one of the back streets. He found an abandoned overturned van and hid inside, trying to catch his breath. In just 3 days, the world was turned upside down. Yudu Hayek frowned, pursing his lips. Jai Min was telling the truth after all. During the trials, many people die. What is happening is a drama under the guise of a game. For some reason unknown to him, Yudu Hayek here was a famous person that everyone wanted to kill. Yudu Hayek frowned and looked at the sickle wrapped around his neck. Its ability is to absorb objects that it touches, so attacking just for the sake of them was completely reckless. He needed skills to survive, because the people he's dealing with want to kill him. Yudu Hayek frowned seriously as he stared straight ahead. He looked back at the book he had received from the angel. The lawlessness that was happening did not give him the right to surrender to them. A system notification flashed with a description: secret book, fist and foot technique book, special challenge reward, read the book and get one of the fist and foot techniques from C to AA rank. Yudu Hayek picked up the book and opened it, feeling a little tense. As soon as he opened the book, a bright light blinded the guy and the book was illuminated with a blue glow. The writing from the book began to spread out over his hands, reaching his face and covering his entire body. Yudu Hayek clenched his teeth as he coughed violently and started coughing up blood. He couldn't understand what that feeling was. Another system notification was displayed, which said, "You have received the extremely powerful stop technique. Skill level 1. When the power of the technique affected by the skill level increases, a special condition is activated." Yudu Hayek suddenly remembered how to use the technique after all. An extremely powerful foot is based on kicks. He wondered if his fitness level would be enough to handle it. Yudu Hayek took off his bloodstained hoodie and tensed up. He placed the iron jar on top of the box. Opening his eyes abruptly, Yudu Hayek kicked out and then accidentally fell to the ground along with the boxes. He rubbed his lower back and thought about how to master this technique then. Yudu Hayek thought about wanting something to eat. The boy smiled and held the sickle in his hands as he thought about the fact that it was Hook's turn to be eaten. He said the word food and a bright light appeared, enveloping the item. A system notification flashed up that said, "Pain Hook item, absorption completed, you have received pain maximization level 3. Yudu Hayek covered his mouth and thought that every time he uses this ability, the stench is just awful. He looked down at the ground, where a few more hooks were lying. He thought about what it looked like to eat the rest of the hooks as well. Weapons are quite suitable as food. Yudu Hayek looked at them with a not very happy face and hesitantly said the word food once more. The poor guy dropped to all fours and thought only that he wished the taste wasn't so disgusting after all. A system notification flashed that said, "Item Pain Hook, absorption completed, you have received pain maximization level 4. Yudu Hayek noticed another notification that said that extra calories will be replaced with coins. You have received 566 coins, the balance number of coins is 644. Yudu Hayek smiled nervously. Apparently, there really was an automatic exchange for coins. Yudu Hayek thought that since that was the case, it was basically okay to be patient. After a while, he peeked out from his hiding place, looking around. He wondered if something would happen if he suddenly came out now. The stranger was already standing on the roof of the van, and Yudu Hayek didn't immediately notice him. The man was holding a knife, hovering over the guy. Yudu Hayek felt a gaze behind him and abruptly jumped back when the man landed next to him. The guy barely managed to avoid the blow. The man hunched over and told him that he had seen Yudu Hayek in action. Yudu Hayek looked at him with shock on his face. He clenched his jaw tightly and didn't say anything. It was the scoundrel. He remembered the man who first called out his name and drew the attention of infected people to him. The man started waving a huge knife in front of him and said with a smile on his face that Yudu Hayek had taken down a named monster. He grinned and added that Yudu Hayek was a lucky guy. However, as always, Yudu Hayek took a couple of steps back and stiffened as he looked at the man in front of him. He shouted loudly and asked the man who he was and how he knew Yudu Hayek. The man smirked at his question and added that Yudu Hayek really didn't seem to remember anything. The man immediately rushed in his direction with words about how heartless the guy is after all. Yudu Hayek attacked him with a kick, but the man easily dodged it. He rushed towards him again and asked Yu Hayek with a crazy smile, "What is this useless attack and why is he not using his essence?" Yu Hayek kept hitting him with his bare hands, and at one point the man caught him and punched him in the stomach. Yu Hayek fell to the ground and doubled over. The man across from him was looking down at him with a disgruntled face. He chuckled as he lowered his weapon to his shoulder and noted with displeasure that he was extremely disappointed. And it seemed that Yu Hayek's killing of that monster was really just luck, and it also seemed that he had lost his memory from not knowing how to fight. Yu Hayek looked up and looked at him from under his brows. His eyes lit up with a bright light, and inscriptions crawled across his face. Extremely powerful foot. Yu Hayek leapt up and swung, but the man easily jumped up and avoided the blow. He was about to smile happily and laugh at the man when Yu Hayek's foot was already flying towards his face. The man tried to block the blow with his weapon, but as a result, the guy's blow fell on his arm. He took a couple of steps back and rubbed his bruised arm, frowning and gritting his teeth. The man noticed that Yu Hayek changed his movement. Yu Hayek soared into the air above the opponent's head. A system notification was displayed that said, "Activating the extremely powerful foot technique, Salamander Trident, first level." Yu Hayek spun around and abruptly kicked the man's head. Yu Hayek stood back up, ready to defend himself again if anything happened. He caught his breath heavily and looked ahead with a worried expression on his face. Did it really work? The man was lying face down on the ground and didn't make a sound or move. Yu Hayek thought about it. This is the strength of an extremely powerful foot. Suddenly, the man regained consciousness for a second and immediately coughed violently. Yu Hayek looked in disbelief. Was he really fine after such a powerful blow from him? The man sat up and rubbed his neck and said that fortunately he had something that softened the blow. Sure enough, he was wearing a wide gold necklace around his neck. He added that if it wasn't for this thing, he would definitely have already died from such a powerful blow, and that Yu Hayek clearly adapted very quickly. Yu Hayek frowned and looked at the opponent, asking him if he also needed a second entity from him or if the reason was different. He added that judging by the man, he could assume that he already had enough coins and things for the murder and did not need additional ones. The man stood up with a big smile on his face and spread his arms out to the sides, and blue flames appeared on the tips of his fingers. He said that the reason was quite simple, since he, who had received the divine blessing, had lost his memory, then he would be the strongest, and Yu Hayek would just be eliminated. Yu Hayek immediately took up a fighting stance, ready to defend himself. The man charged in and used a fire fist, aiming directly at the guy's jaw. The opponent added that it was still so that Yu Hayek wouldn't want the title again, and that this time he definitely had to succeed. The man kept attacking him with his fire fists while Yu Hayek tried to dodge and dodge them in time. At one point, the blow landed squarely on Yu Hayek's jaw, and he started throwing one punch after another with a crazy smile on his face, saying that this time he would kill him. Yu Hayek grabbed his arm and held him so that he couldn't move, and threw him over himself, sending the man flying behind him. He immediately fell to the floor, rolling on the ground. The man managed to slow himself down by grabbing onto the ground below him and shouted that Yu Hayek was stupid for using the same trick over and over again. Yu Hayek didn't listen to him too much and dived into the handful of dirt under his feet with one hand, sending a wave of sand flying in his direction. Sand immediately hit the man's eyes and he squeezed his eyes shut, clutching his head and cursing Yu Hayek with various words. He started looking around and waving his fists randomly, unable to look straight ahead and shouting about exactly where Yu Hayek was. He kept shouting and told him that only a coward would resort to such dirty tricks. Yu Hayek, however, didn't really listen to him anymore and flew down from above with another punch. His foot landed squarely on his head, and the necklace around his opponent's neck cracked a little. A system notification flashed up and said, "The level of extremely strong foot strike has been raised to level 2 of 10. Yu Hayek once again stood in front of the man and tried to catch his breath. The opponent was lying on the ground with his head smashed through, a pool of blood flowing from his head at the point of impact. Yu Hayek slowly walked up to him. Was he dead? He noticed that his opponent's tongue had fallen out of his mouth and he was not moving again. Suddenly the man's voice interrupted him. He didn't move and barely talked about how it was funny that he was without a weapon, without a powerful item, and even without memories, that he too had received a divine blessing. Yu Hayek asked him again what blessing he was talking about. The man grinned, his face was pale, and blood was running from his mouth and nose. He replied that Yu Hayek didn't even remember that much. He added what he said about perfect beings from another world interfering in things. Suddenly, he giggled and Yu Hayek frowned as he looked at the crazy man and asked him what was so funny. The man paused for a few seconds and replied with a smile on his face that it was just a shame and that Yu Hayek wasn't quite the great king he once was. Not number one, not the strongest of the phenomenal 9, not a legendary warrior who rebelled against God, but just a shell of him. The other party madly yelled at Yu Hayek and told him to just get lost and that he didn't stand a chance against God. The man slowly began to lose consciousness. He fell to the ground again and finally said that next time he would definitely become a great king. A system notification was displayed that said, "You have killed a person, the reward is 51 coins. The conditions for activating the entity beyond the horizon are met." When the owner of the entity receives a stimulus that goes beyond the ordinary, his abilities increase in proportion to the impact of the stimulus. Yoo-doo Hayek clenched his hand into a fist and slammed it on the ground, shouting about what was going on here and why he was the only person who didn't remember anything at all. Yoo-doo Hayek stood up and put on the necklace taken from the dead man. He covered the man's upper body with his blood-stained jacket, taking the man's cape instead. He wondered what he should do next. Yoo-doo Hayek rummaged through the pockets of his cape and found a crumpled piece of map. He took it out to get a better look at the contents. There was a place circled in the center of the map, and Yoo-doo Hayek realized that this was probably where the god that the scoundrel had told him about was supposed to be. Yoo-doo Hayek clenched his hand into a fist, his hand trembling. He frowned and clenched his teeth tightly. He needed to see for himself, just to look at what they thought was a god and a perfect being. A waterfall flowed down between two huge rocks. Not far from it were dilapidated walls with animal figures on them. Yoo-doo Hayek walked inside the cave, dripping wet from the waterfall. He took off his hood and looked around in surprise. He looked in front of him and realized that there was a hidden place behind the waterfall. A corridor appeared in front of him that went straight, and at the end of this corridor, a bright green sphere was burning. Yoo-doo Hayek walked forward a bit, looking around. He stopped at the entrance. After thinking about something for a while, he still took a step forward and went inside. Inside was a large hall with the figure of a man sitting on a throne. He opened his eyes in surprise and couldn't figure out what kind of place it was. Suddenly, bright torches flanked him. Yoo-doo Hayek had to shield her eyes from the sudden harsh light. The hall was now well lit. He looked at the figure in front of him and wondered whose statue it was and who it was. A statue of a strange woman sat majestically on a throne, her arms wrapped around two snakes. Suddenly, a system notification flashed in front of his eyes, stating that a message from the goddess Kahira had been received. There was a voice in his head that told him to choose. The voice echoed in his head and he remembered that something similar had happened to him before in his room. A voice in her head told Yoo-doo Hayek to choose her religion and that she would guide him. Yoo-doo Hayek looked at the statue in front of him with a shocked face and didn't understand what it was about and why could the stone statue communicate. The voice continued to speak and added that she was Kahira, the fire queen of the underworld, the creator of this world. The ruler that Yoo-doo Hayek will devote his life to worshipping and serving. Even if he had followed other gods before, she would light him with the flame of mercy and give him all the strength he needed if he swore to serve her. A notice flashed up saying that the goddess Kahira was demanding to bow down before her. The voice spoke to him again, telling him to think faster, to get down on his knees, bow his head, and swear allegiance. Yoo-doo Hayek still couldn't figure out what exactly was going on. Is it possible to gain strength by becoming a believer? What had she told him? Yoo-doo Hayek was standing in front of the statue, which was looking at him with a menacing stone gaze. He couldn't figure out what to do. Bow down before God. A god who suddenly showed up and forced everyone to participate in a deadly game. A god who plays with people like chess pieces. He recalled the image of Jai-min and her words that he should lead people to kill the cursed god. Yoo-doo Hayek didn't need anyone's blessing. The boy scowled menacingly, his eyes blazing with rage. He loudly replied that he wasn't going to follow God. Suddenly, the guy collapsed to the ground as if something had pinned him to the floor. A voice in his head said that he was a fool and that he would crawl on the floor until he could cultivate faith. Yoo-doo Hayek continued to lie on the floor, chained by invisible forces. Was this really the work of the gods? Because of them, people fight and kill each other, frame and tear apart. And with all this knowledge, should Yoo-doo Hayek really want to convert? Yoo-doo Hayek leaned on the floor, his hand trembling. He forced himself to stand up and shouted loudly that he would never, ever obey God. A voice in his head asked loudly, why was he rejecting her? Suddenly, fire broke out on either side of the guy, leaving only the huge cross that Yoo-doo Hayek was standing on. The guy looked around sharply and saw the figure of a woman in front of him. Her hair was on fire, and her body was entwined with two giant red snakes. A giant figure came down and said that if he wanted to be a sacrificial lamb, then she would take his heart. The woman extended her index finger in his direction. Yoo-doo Hayek immediately let out a loud cry, and a bright light flashed in his chest, causing the man to cower. He continued to shout loudly while his eyes glowed with a white light. A system notification was displayed stating that the conditions for activating the entity were met. The voice kept asking him in frustration why Yoo-doo Hayek didn't want to submit to her, and why he doesn't want to love God. Yoo-doo Hayek screamed loudly while his entire body was covered in bright flames. The voice kept telling him that for such a terrible sin, he would die a painful death by burning. A system notification was displayed, which read, the conditions for activating the entity beyond the horizon were met, the intervention of the goddess was detected, and the forces were cancelled. The goddess noticed this in surprise and did not understand how her power could have disappeared. The girl opened her mouth, revealing her snake-like fangs. A red screen flashed up with information that read, "System message, penalty for breaking a rule, eye for eye punishment, revoking Kahira's status as a goddess." The goddess' body began to crack, and bright light poured out from the cracks of her body. She screamed loudly as she asked why she was the one, and how could a non-entity like Yudu Hayek have her own divine essence? Yudu Hayek covered up as the goddess' body exploded. The angels outside started panicking and talking about how dangerous it was, so what was going on now that the goddess Kahira was gone? The angel began to bite his nails and talk in a panic about how the earth would shake, and the sky would split, a power that had lost its owner would break out and burn the world to the ground. The angel of power held the orb in his hands and looked at it thoughtfully. He said that it happened even earlier than originally planned, but there was nothing to be done. The angel said that he would try to fix the situation by superimposing one world on another. He took another ball and began to combine the two spheres together. The ground began to rise into the air as the angels watched. One of them laughed and said that everything was neatly covered. He sat on the mountain and talked about how he could sense that strange guy Yudu Hayek was definitely somewhere nearby, and could he have died from a sudden explosion? Suddenly, the angel noticed a weapon in fragments. He looked at the weapon thoughtfully and said that if Yudu Hayek had lasted longer, he might have been able to survive then. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted aloud by a hand grabbing his leg. A charred body with no clothes or hair stared at the angel. It was Yudu Hayek. He smiled nervously and said that he had no doubt that he would be so remarkable. He pulled out Yudu Hayek, who leaned on a rock, holding the weapon that the angel had given him. He said the word food and immediately recovered. The angel revealed his status and said that for someone who had just survived the explosion, Yudu Hayek was too ordinary.